Whew, we got a lot to cover tonight, so let's get smarter with the help of our lead-off panel. NBC's national political correspondent, my dear friend Michael Memoli, is here. He has covered President Biden, his family, and his inner circle of advisors for more than a decade. Susan Glasser joins us, staff writer for The New Yorker. She co-authored the book The Divider about Trump's time in the White House, and former attorney Joyce Vance, who spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor and now is an MSNBC contributor. Mr. Memoli, let's turn to you first. It appears that President Biden's campaign is focused, and they have got their message, warning that Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy. What can you tell us?
Yes, Steph, when we, of course, remember how President Biden kicked off his 2020 campaign, which was talking about a battle for the soul of America. And now, as we turn the calendar to 2024, the very first public speech we're going to hear from President Biden is going to make it clear that he feels that this fight for the soul of this country is still very much engaged. Now, this is a significant, albeit potentially a temporary shift, though, from what we have been hearing from the president. Because if you look back at 2023, not at what the campaign was saying in press releases, but what we saw from the paid advertising that the campaign was putting before swing voters across the country, it was about the economy. When we look at not what the president was saying behind closed doors to campaign donors, but what he was doing in his public events traveling across the country, it was talking about the economy, his legislative accomplishments. When we're talking about an election that's still 300 days away, at the moment, the Biden campaign has felt that the economy, getting the president's record out there, is very important. But there is an important change now, because we are talking about what the campaign and the president himself believes was a traumatic, significant event in the course and the history of this country, and that is January 6th. And as Quentin Fultz, the Biden campaign deputy campaign manager, said to our colleague Andrea Mitchell today, there is a moral obligation on the part of the president to seize this moment to remind the country of what is at stake. So the president may not continue to give this kind of speech on a regular basis over the weeks ahead, but this is one of those tentpole critical moments that the campaign wants to really harness to get that urgent message out to the voters across the country, because they do feel this threat to democracy is sort of an ace in the hole message for them in the fall, when there are going to be a lot of doubts among voters about both the candidates on the ballot.
Well, we will not have a functioning and certainly not a thriving economy if we lose our democracy. Susan, what is your take? The DNC trying to emphasize election denialism as the center of Trump's GOP.
You know, I think here we are at the beginning of 2024, and it's going to be a story of two different campaigns speaking to radically different audiences in different ways. It's going to be that sort of red America, blue America campaign. I think there's no better example of that than how Biden and Trump are going to be talking about January 6th, because it's not as clear cut as President Biden's going to give a speech on Friday and he's going to talk about January 6th and election denialism as the greatest threat to democracy. Because in the mirror image version of that on Saturday, Donald Trump, he's not going to just cede the point on January 6th and talk about other things. He's doubled down over the last 3 years on election denialism. He's made that, frankly, a pillar of what it means to be a Republican today. And I think that's, to me, one of the most striking things about this 2024 campaign is that both candidates are going to be talking about the 2020 election. Donald Trump has reinvented January 6th as a story about martyrs and about, you know, the persecution he faced by the deep state. And it's another example of his grievances. And he's brought the Republican Party with him. Even Republican elected officials who were critical of him and his role on January 6th are now endorsing Donald Trump for another term in office. So I just feel like it's not just about what Biden says about January 6th, but the contrast with how Trump is also campaigning on it. That's what really is chilling to me as we begin this election year.
Joyce, isn't the election also about how much we value the rule of law? Like, what's at stake when it comes to that?
You know, it's absolutely true. People have said that this is an election about whether we will continue to be a democracy. It's an election about the rule of law. But those are such antiseptic concepts to so many American voters. Voters are more used to thinking about kitchen table sorts of issues. And so the challenge that Joe Biden faces here is whether he can make these very abstract concepts much more concrete enough that voters will carry them into the polling places with them and vote on them like they would on other substantive issues.
Well, let's talk about where he's going, Michael. The president is in Valley Forge, PA on Friday. He's then going to be in Charleston on Monday. Why is the campaign focusing on those locations?
Well, the president, of course, considers Pennsylvania something of a second home. He's done more events in the state of Pennsylvania, which, remember, was the state that put him over 270 electoral votes than just about any other state. This is also thematically consistent with how the president has sort of proceeded both in the 2020 campaign and as president, choosing important historical markers for the country to remind the people about what is at stake. And so this is a message very much for voters as a whole. When we see him go to South Carolina on Monday, that speaks to another very important part of the Biden coalition, which is African-American voters. They are the ones who, as the president likes to say, brung him to the dance. They put him in the position to be the president of the United States. They have, for Democrats, the first primary, and the president wants to make it clear he still has their backs in the way that they have always had his back. We've seen the president's standing among black voters slip some in the polls. And this also reflects a real imperative on the part of the Biden campaign. They need to shore up his key base coalition in order to have a fighting chance in what will be a razor-close election next November.
All right, new topic. Joyce, let's talk about Donald Trump's appeal to the Supreme Court. He is trying to stay on Colorado's ballot. I want to share what his former White House lawyer, Ty Cobb, said earlier about it.
I don't think they'll reach the issue of was it or was it not an insurrection. I think the issue is not whether or not Trump participated or gave aid and comfort to insurrectionists, but whether Article 3 of the 14th Amendment actually applies to the president. And I think there, sadly, that Trump has the winning hand under the Constitution.
But, Joyce, I want to share Trump's lawyers. The first thing they write in their appeal, it is a fundamental principle that the people should choose whom they please to govern them. How ironic is that when you think about what this whole thing is about?
Yeah, the hubris of that line, it's the very first line in this petition for certiorari, and you read that, and it's sort of like smacking the American people in the face for someone who did so much to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election to now claim that he's the great defender of American voters. To Ty Cobb's point, though, there are a lot of procedural off-ramps that the Supreme Court could take that would let Trump stay on the ballot in Colorado. Cobb is, of course, referring to the decision that was made by the trial court in Colorado. It was that judge who first said that Trump as president was not someone who was qualified under the 14th Amendment, Section 3 for removal. The Colorado Supreme Court reversed her. That's one of many possible options the Supreme Court has if they don't want to remove the leading Republican candidate. That's the way Trump's lawyers describe him, from the ballot.
Susan, what is at stake politically with this appeal? Because if Trump is victorious, he will use this to beef up his political mojo as though he just beat Joe Biden, which he hasn't.
Well, look, I mean, how much are individual voters in battleground states paying attention to what's happening in a different state in Colorado? I don't know the answer to that, how much they're, into the machinations of the many, many, many legal actions of Donald Trump. I mean, frankly, it's an overwhelming number. Donald Trump is in court more than he is in the caucuses in this 2024 election. And that's a reality that is so untested. None of us really knows what the political implications of it are. I do think I've heard even from Republicans voicing a concern that throwing Trump off the ballot is something that would give fuel and fodder to Trump politically speaking, that it would only aggrandize him in the view of his followers. It would only be offered to them as proof that somehow there's a conspiracy out to get him, that the way to defeat Trump is to defeat him fair and square. Now, of course, Republicans who are saying that have to take a step back, take a deep breath, and realize, well, Donald Trump lost fair and square in 2020. And of course, we wouldn't be having any of these legal maneuverings had he simply conceded the results of the election, as all of his predecessors in American history had done. So, of course, this is fundamentally about an anti-democratic president now testing all of the institutions of democracy. It does seem like this case is a long shot in the sense that it would stand that he would be thrown off the ballot in Colorado. I do think there's an expectation that somehow the Supreme Court will find a way to avoid that outcome.
Mike, this stuff really is thorny for President Biden and his campaign. How are they thinking about Trump's criminal indictments? Like, are we going to see them talk a whole lot more about it as the cases get closer and closer?
Well, it's so interesting, and it's the right question, Steph, because when you talk to Biden campaign advisors, they're critical sometimes of how we are covering the former president. They think that we are covering him more as a legal drama than as a potential future commander-in-chief, somebody who is about to be, in their view, the standard bearer for the Republican Party. They don't see much value in engaging in discussion of what the legal problems are of former President Trump. They want to warn voters about what he would do if he is given 4 more years in the White House. And it's also interesting to look at how they're approaching these questions about ballot access for the former president. The Biden campaign, the White House, whenever we've asked them about whether it's Maine or Colorado, they have refused to engage in this. And some of this is about President Biden as an old school institutionalist, right? He's a former chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He has not shied away from being critical of the Supreme Court once they've made a decision. You only need to look at the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade as an example. But when the Supreme Court is likely to consider these questions and has yet to do so, they are wary, the president himself is wary of trying to tip the balance of being seen as interfering in some of their decision making. The separation of powers is important. And so that speaks to how sometimes the president, to the frustration of Democrats at times, may be overly institutionalist here and fighting a fight maybe with one arm behind his back.
My goodness, it is complicated and could not be more important.